Hello and welcome to the Prism Hues tutorial. It's a plugin pack for Final Cut Pro 10. The built-in Prism effect in Final Cut 10 is kind of harsh and very limited on options, and Prism Hues gives you a lot more control over that. So let's take a look. First off, let's turn it on. You're not going to see that much of a difference. I didn't go crazy with the initial look, very kind of subtle. But we can obviously turn this up to 32, but as most Final Cut users know, you can click and hold down on that number and push up and get kind of crazy. I don't know why they do that, but that's the way they do that. I'm going to kind of go a little more than we normally would, just so you can see the difference. And you notice it creates these color fringes on the edges, which this happens with the one built into Final Cut. I hate it. And so I tried to correct that too. We'll come back to that. But for right now, we're just going to leave it. You'll notice that there are two prisms here. And sometimes if I wanted to get a little crazy, I noticed that having a second one would allow me a little more control to push it a little further. I'm not going to mess with that here. That's for you to mess with if you want it to be a little stronger or have some secondary effects, then that'll kind of allow you to do that. But for here, we'll just stick with the one. I've got it set to 12 on the angle. No reason, just preference. You can set it to 0, but I don't know. I like it on 12 to start with. So skipping down to the hue, this is what I kind of really wanted. Being able to change the hue was interesting to me because the normal prism effect, you can see mostly kind of blue and red, but if you wanted to get like chromatic aberration, which is more like magenta and green, you couldn't really do that with the other one. But then that was kind of a jumping off point. It's like, well, it's kind of cool that you can kind of match the look of if you're going for a look or have a LUT or something, or wanted to go with kind of a purple or a crazy color, you could do that. So just having this, you can choose kind of your color palette. I'll leave it at 0 for now. Prism saturation. This only goes up to 3 for whatever reason. You cannot hold it and drag it down. I don't know why it does that, but that's the way it does it. But sometimes you can totally bring it out as well. But this does go up to 3. 1.5 was kind of the midpoint that it started at. But I wanted a little more control over that. I'm going to push it up just a little bit so we can see more of the effect as we're kind of messing with some of these parameters. You can obviously mix it in or out with the opacity. I'll leave it at full. Now the blur amount, this is not for really sharp. The way this is set up to have this kind of control, you're not going to get very sharp edges. But that's kind of what I wanted to avoid with this plugin, because you can get that in the other one. But so the blur amount, you can blur it further. It goes up to 64. Same rule. You can click and hold down on this and you can push it even further. This was just so I had a little more control over making it even more soft if I wanted, or more subtle. Now the Prism blur, mix, you can bring that out 100%. But I kind of liked being able to have like a little secondary control. It doesn't show up as much on this footage right here, but sometimes I wanted that, so I added it. I'm going to bring that back down to, I'll set it to 0, back down to, it starts at 10. I'm going to put it to 0 right now because I added a smear. It's kind of a light ray kind of smear. And you can really smear it. And it just spreads it a little bit more. That's going to depend on your footage and to your taste, but I thought it was a good option to have. I'll leave it back down to, I'm going to put this back down to, put the prism blur back to the default. Smear, I'll leave it at, I should show the smear center. I'm going to turn this back up, and you can actually change kind of the direction because it's based off like a light ray kind of thing. So, that's cool, and you can animate that too. Change the X and the Y of that. So just to give you some options for dreamy looks. Okay, so the next section is the color balance. Now this one's a little interesting, and I'm going to explain why it's included. because most of the time you're going to be making your color corrections in, Color Finale or the built-in one. It's not necessarily for that. It's to make sure that the footage stays true to what it looked like originally. Like in this one of the water, if I toggle it off, you'll see kind of what it's doing. These aren't set to neutral or naturally where they are when you put this on. They have adjustments on them already, and that's what enables all this up here. But in some instances, it will have this effect. I'll switch over to this piece of footage. Now I'm going to turn on Boldish, which is a preset for the plugins. It's basically basic, but it's pushed. So it's got more of a look. So I'm going to turn it on, and you'll see how gross that looks. Now, if you can toggle this off and on, you can see the effect is still there. Much like going back to the water, if you toggle this off and on, it looks kind of gross. So this is kind of correcting it in a way. But this is the reason I left it on. 9 times out of 10, it's going to look like the water. It's going to look okay. But on some footage, maybe because of the really high contrast, it might look bad. So here's the fix. You got your highlights and midtone shadows. It's more often than not going to be the midtones, in my experience. If you click on it, you notice there's a slight boost. That's fine. You leave it there. It's more often going to be the highlights or the shadows. Here, you notice that the shadows brought way down. You can bring them up. It's not really fixing it. So I'll put it back to where it was. In this one, it's going to be probably the shadows, which there's a slight boost in the shadows. But if you do that, you lift it up, and you're kind of getting back to where it looked like originally, and you still got the effect intact. In fact, even on this one, I would adjust the midtone up even more a little bit. This footage might have a little HDR or something going on, so it's a little bit exaggerated even on top of that. But that's why this is included. You normally won't have to mess with it, but it's there just in case you do. Okay, moving back. So what if you just wanted a vignette? You just wanted it around the edges. I included a vignette, so you can turn it on here. And you can still see, got some nice soft business going on there. The reason it is at 0.1 by default is there was something screwy with motion, which is what this plugin was created in. So if you see that, that's why. Just to be sure it wouldn't mess with anything, I just put it at 0.1. But you can turn that up, and obviously you've got your position, you've got your scale. So you scale it down, scale it up. You've got your curvature for the edges if you want to get that granular with it. The feather, we'll turn it down. I've got it set way up. I like my vignettes pretty soft, and so then you can really see where it is. Okay, I'm going to set that feather back up to nice. Included the fall off as well, in case you wanted to mess with that. So let's get to the edges. This is terrible. No one likes this. It looks awful. I don't know, maybe you do. Maybe you want to leave it. I didn't. So what I did was I created basically a mask that would feather it out. So these both start for the X and Y at 100%. So let's just kind of be ridiculous. I'm going to drag this down. Goes away pretty quickly. So you're not literally getting rid of it. You're getting rid of the effect slowly, so to speak. It's just a really highly feathered edge. And I've left the position in here, and I've left the fallout and the feather, so you can get really granular with this of how you want to remove it. This is the main one though. Just by lowering it, you can see it go away. You may not, I don't try to get it completely gone. Well, it's on a knife's edge right there. Let's see. Starting about 80%. Of course, we've got it. This is a pretty, an exaggerated amount to begin with. So we're being a little bit hyperbolic here. But so you can kind of just fade that out. And the reason they're independent is because depending on where you have the angle, they're going to be different. You know, it could be stronger at the bottom than on the sides. So that is the reason that I've got, one, these two separate, but also even the edge position. Depending on how much you want to do the feathering, you can actually change the position of it as well. Just gives you complete control of how you're getting rid of those edges. Let's fix that bottom one. Drag it down just a little bit, and you'll just notice it kind of fade away. Now it's getting rid of the effect entirely, but it's just kind of smoothed away, and hopefully, you know, most people, their eyes are going to be drawn to the center of the screen. They won't even notice. Okay, so that's the basic. That's kind of a starting point. So this is the first preset. It's called Boldish. It's basically the basic one, but more with a look. It's pushed. So I'm going to turn it on. And you have all the same controls. This has a little bit in that Prism 2 as well. You can change the hue. A lot of the same controls. I won't spend too much time on this. Is very similar to the other one. It's just I kind of pushed it a little further, and it's got a little bit of a look. So somewhat self-explanatory. There is a little more control as far as horizontal and vertical blur. Just to be a little more playful, have a little more options for this. You can turn it down and see what that looks like. But just something to play with. They're both at 100 to start with, but if you want to, bring them down, you can see how drastic that is with the mix when you mix in that separate blurring to kind of soften the whole thing up. You got your smear. If you want to basically blur it even further, which can get really dreamy and kind of cool. This one does have a contrast because this is bold. What the original, the basic does not have is a contrast. Now, you don't want to go too crazy with it because it kind of starts flipping over. But if you just want a little bit of a boost, a little more color, especially if you've blurred it a lot, but you want to bring more, color back into it, kept that in. But basically, the rest is pretty much the same and self-explanatory. All right, moving on. Next up, we have Dream Rays. I dig this one. All right, we'll turn it on, play it a little bit. I like that. You can adjust the opacity if you want it more subtle. I mean, on some of these, depending on the footage that you put it over, you might have to push it even more. It really depends on what you put it over, how much it shows up. But focus just on this for now. The edge size, you can see you can get it really soft, or you can get kind of crazy with it. And let's see what that looks like. It's got a lot of variation in this one. I kind of like it kind of dreamy. The refraction, it just kind of moves it. This also will allow you, you're playing with these settings, you can get a lot of different results from really fine strands, if you want to call them that. I'll put that back to where it was, and I'm going to up this back to closer to the original. The speed, you can adjust the speed. This is kind of the normal speed. Let's see. Go crazy. Put it down a little bit. Slow it down even if you want. That's slow. Okay. Let's see. And the blur can really make them soft. I've got a little blur on there naturally, as far as the default rather. But let me boost that speed back up. So you can get them really sharp. You can get a lot more rays or a lot less rays, a lot of blur or really sharp. Now I added this because I noticed some footage, some of it would kind of disappear a little bit. So I added a boost. Your mileage is going to vary on this, but this is, you can notice the opacity kind of going up. It's not an opacity thing. It's more of a kind of a doubling of the effect. This will really vary on your footage. But I left it in there in case you weren't getting enough. You got some control over it. Contrast. If you want to, I've noticed with the contrast, if you boost it up, you're kind of getting rid of some of this haze around the outside. Could have called it haze, but contrast is explanatory enough. The pivot, if you depends on, here again, it depends on the footage, but if you bring the pivot down, you notice how bright they get when you boost so basically boost edge effect, contrast, and the contrast pivot were to make sure you've got enough controls. Like if you put it on some footage and it's not showing up enough, you've got some controls to actually to push that further. The contrast luminance only. This here again, you can play with it. There again, kind of depend on the footage you're putting it over. But like here, you're going to get a lot more saturation, obviously. Okay, let's see, get that back to normal. Prism amount. I mean, you can kind of see the separation already here. That's the default, but if you want to go crazy, go crazy. You push it far enough, you start seeing the green, in the middle. This is more kind of the default that I had. You can change the angle, which that's not as important to me, but what I did like about it is you can keyframe it. And if you wanted to animate it over time, it would give it a little more kind of motion as the clip is playing. So I thought that was cool. So I left it in. Set that to 0. Back to the hue. If you want to change the color of it, like say, oh, okay, this is in the mountains. I kind of want it maybe a little blue. You can kind of get that, kind of get closer to that color. Okay. And then you can dial this mix down if you like the lines, but you only want a little bit of the prism or none. You can take it out. Let's see what that looks like. A lot of variations going on here. The blur length. This is going to soften them, kind of bring them in. So if you really want it towards the edge of the screen more, you can go all the way up. The max on that is 200. Direction, I probably wouldn't use this. Let me lower this a little bit. I probably myself might not use this much, but you could animate it. You can make it kind of sweep if you want. Or if you don't have something where you are paying attention to the center of the screen, say that the focus or the subject of the screen was maybe up here or in a different, quadrant of the image, you could adjust these to kind of draw the eye towards a particular part, because there is a vignette, on here. And of course, you can turn it down and you're going to get a texture over it, but it's on there by default. But you can change the position of it, which we'll come to a little bit later. So that's the reason the direction is in here, is if you want to do something that's not going towards the center. Zoom amount. I mean, further kind of smear and blur it out. You can go all the way down. This is a caustic generator that it's based off of. So I don't like that as much, but let me bring some prism back in here. But this is kind of smearing it out. But if you want that look, it's in there, which is the reason I added a zoom/caustic look. If you want more of that in there, you can kind of dial back and forth while keeping some zoom kind of blur in there as well. You can dial between these things. Okay. The background blur. If you want to blur the edges, you can do that. Now it starts at 50. You can go to 0, and that's completely sharp. It's got some built on it already, but you can go further. And so you can really blur behind it. Let's see, I'm going to bring that zoom amount back up. Okay. The size, obviously, you can bring that in so you're really focusing on the middle. Let's see, bring that down a little bit. And the saturation. Sometimes if you want to go a little crazy with the edges, desaturate, saturate, you've got options there. Also, something that isn't there initially that you may want is I added a lenticular halo around the whole edge. So if you turn up the opacity of that, you'll notice there's this prismatic spectrum rainbow edge. And you can also change the hue of that if you want to. You can get real trippy with it as well. This is animatable as well. You can keyframe that. The saturation, you can push it. That's crazy, but it's there. It's there if you want to do it. And I'll leave it a little saturated just so you can see it. And the scale, it starts at 160. I was kind of treating it more as a boost to the vignette or the effect, but you can shrink it down. You can get more of it, or you could move it almost completely off where it's just fringing the very corners. You've got options, but by default it is like set to 3%, so it's just barely there, but it's in there. In fact, I'm going to shrink it some. Let's shrink it more towards the middle just so we can see what we're doing. You can see kind of the striations in there. You can blur that if you don't want any of the kind of texture. If you want these lines to be doing the texture and not this, or just to give it some depth, you can bring it back. So let's lower it back. This is also you can keyframe this, you can animate this and have it, I like the idea of slowly rotating it, which you would not be able to see that if you had blurred it enough. It's like, well, let's blur the hell out of it and then rotate it, nothing. But if the blur is down, you can really see these striations. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the lenticular, and you've got that center vignette. So if you bring it down, you're really going to see the underlying caustic generator that this is producing these animated edges. I'm going to bring that up. But you've got control over it. Starts at 100, but you've got control over it. If you really wanted to change the position of the, let's lower it. Let's see the scale. I'm going to lower the scale. And you can change it. Like if the focus is up here, you can change that. If the focus is top left, you can kind of change that. All right, moving on. Aberrative edges. Basically, if you want kind of a chromatic aberration around the edges of the screen, it's already got the vignette turned on. Let's turn this on. I find this to be a little exaggerated, but just so you can see the effect, this is the default. You can boost how much. Obviously, it's already a little crazy. Turn it back down. You can adjust the angle, obviously. The hue. You can turn it to colors that lenses don't really fringe in some of these colors. So it's the reason it's not called chromatic edges or something. It's just called aberration at the edges, basically. You can change the hue, which is cool. You can adjust the saturation. This will go crazy. I mean, I don't like that, but mostly you can dial it back a little bit, bring it down. You can boost it if you want. I'll leave it a little boosted just for the sake of the tutorial. The Prism mix, obviously you can dial the whole thing back. That's kind of a global control there. The Prism blur amount, you can blur it. In fact, at default, the Prism blur mix is set to 25. I'm gonna go ahead and set up to 100 so you can kind of see what it's doing. But the blur amount, if you bring it down, obviously it's going to get tighter. So you can kind of affect how not only how sharp it is, but if there's a little bit of a bloom on it, kind of like the basic plugin. On this one, you've got your vertical blur. and your horizontal blur independent, in case you want to mess with that as well. The vignette size, kind of self-explanatory. What is different here is the darken. If you want to, it's got a little bit on there already. If you want to darken the edges, in fact, I will lower the size a little bit so you can really see that. I've got it set on a really subtle starting point. I'll leave that a little darker. Okay. Saturation, how much it saturates towards the edge. Just really kind of control the edges of your screen and how out of whack you want them to look. This one also has the lenticular halo built into it, in case you want that. Those are the same as the previous, the dream rays. You can animate all that, all the same controls there. You, yet again, can adjust where the center is. Let me bring the scale down so we can I'm going to bring the scale and the feather way down so we can actually see what we're doing here. Obviously, moving this left or right if you want to focus on a particular part of the screen. That's in there. Okay, feather was crazy high. Okay. So this has the Prism edge fix, much like the basic. Let's go crazy here. Let's see if we can get it to... They don't all fringe all the time, but when they do, let's see. So if we want to get rid of... This looks awful. It looks awful. But if we want to get rid of this fringing that's mostly happening up and down the left and right side here, we've got the same thing here. So I mean, you can literally see what it's doing. And you can adjust that feather. Right now it's set to 120, which is pretty tight, but you can go up to really, really soft and really dial in how exactly you want those edges to disappear. And you can just lower it. You don't even have to get rid of it completely, but it's not so crazy. Okay, moving on to the next one. The eye. This bulges the center, blurs the edges, puts a prismatic look back there as well. And you can control all of this. The radius, exactly. You can kind of see what it's doing right there. I mean, you can get some pretty trippy effects. We'll leave it right there. Actually, we'll bring it down. You can kind of see, whoops. You can see the effect, the line, and you can control the thickness of that. How high, how much it's distorting that underlying image with a height, basically kind of a bump map, so to speak. And the displacement mix is going to depend on what your settings, are, is whether or not you see it. Like if it's really crazy off here, it's almost like an opacity of it, but you can get some kind of double imaging going on there. We'll play that, see what that looks like. So that's nice. I'm going to put it back to 0 for this. You can change the position of it, X and Y, obviously. How much the bulge. You might not like it going that much, but you can and you can animate this. You can keyframe this. Same thing with the scale. Oh, sorry about that. I don't know who wants that. But if you want, you can do this by minor degrees, obviously. Okay. And how much it's mixed in. There again, you're going to get that kind of double image, but you may want that kind of like disorienting focus on something. Here again, standard fare, prism amount, angle, hue. I mean, we can kind of see the prism effect right here. Let's boost that up so we can see more of it. We'll go a little drastic for this, and you can change the hue of it. Just more control. How much is in it? Prism mix. I've got it mixed down just a little bit by default, so it's more subtle, but you can mix it all the way up. I'll leave it at 100. Blur, horizontal blur, vertical blur. How much that is mixed in. You can adjust the vignette itself, all these same controls, darken, saturate, mix it. Complete control over the vignette itself. and that edge fix is in here as well. So if you want to get rid of some of this fringing, let's see, it's pretty good. And there's a little bit top and bottom, so I'll just drag that down, and boom, it's kind of gone. Gone enough to where it's not distracting. And you've got all the standard things there from the previous ones. All right, moving on. This one's pretty simple. It's just a lenticular halo. Final Cut, to my knowledge, does not have one built in. But this one, not only can you adjust the scale and position it, where you want it, but I've added, obviously, the hue, some kind of standard things, the opacity, saturation. You can go crazy with it if you want. How blurred it is, much like the previous one, the aberrative edges. If you want those striations or not, you can have your preference. I'm going to leave it low because not only can you change the position, but the rotation. So you could give it just a little. You could rotate the whole thing, obviously. Give it a little motion, which I'll come back to that in a second. Lenticular intensity. This is just pushing that saturation a little. It's not just saturation. If you see, it's kind of getting brighter and blooming as well. So if you want to go hardcore, I left that in there. You've got spread. If you really want to push this out, let's go down with it and all the way up. You can really make it soft and subtle. This has a prism on it, which is kind of weird because it's already kind of like a spectrum here. But I added a prism because it seemed to give it a little more depth. Not just a lenticular halo, but it gave it a little depth. But if you take it off, it's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But if you add it in, it gave it some color fringing to the color. I just thought it had some depth. I thought it looked good. You can change the angle of that. Just kind of gives it this wavy look. If you want to animate this, it kind of waves it. But getting to this, I added a movement and a speed. So if we play it, it's barely moving. I mean, it's slow. But if you up the movement, might need to do a little bit more. I'm gonna up the speed too, just so you can kind of see it. It's going to undulate a little bit. It might be hard to see, but it might be harder to see because it's over some waves, but maybe I should go crazy with it. I mean, you can see it moving as I'm doing this slider. It's going to, there, that's good. You can dial that in as subtle as you want, but sometimes these things need just a little bit of movement. Okay, moving on. VHS Light, turning it on. Kind of self-explanatory. It's not like a straight up VHS. There's so many VHS plugins, but this one, and you can adjust all this stuff, but it's kind of a light. You kind of losing some information in the highlights. You've got some color fringing. You've got you can tell it's been sharpened. So, but you've got some control over here. Some obvious stuff. Let's say the ghost image. It's got a little bit of one, but let's move that to 100%. If you go to the scale, I've got it subtle, deep, let's go crazy. I don't know, you might want to do that, but just to get a little like image separation, it can be real subtle with it. And then you can, dial in the scale just so you can kind of see it and the focus of it. So that double image also has kind of a blurring. It's like defocusing on it as well. Sharpen it just to give it that VHS look, and the amount, it's real subtle. You don't want to go that crazy with it, I don't guess, but it's there. You can adjust how much sharpening. Let me lower that a little bit. Saturation, obviously, what that is. Tint and temperature. You look at a lot of old VHS footage and it's rarely color corrected well. So the tint, you're going to get kind of your red and blue or teal, whatever you want to call it. And then the temperature, you're going to get more purple and green. So if you want to push it incorrectly in a direction, fine. You can toggle the color balance off and on. This is just, kind of pushing it. Nothing terribly drastic here, but just trying to get a little more of that VHS look. But if you don't like that, or you want to do your own color correction to your underlying footage, you can turn that off and start fresh. This kind of looks crazy because of, forget what the default is. Let's turn it back on. Either way, this just makes sure that you've got control of your footage of this effect. If you push this prism effect really hard, you're going to get the color fringing on the edges. It's got that fix in there as well. All right, moving on. The last three rather are Rainbow Trip, Fever Dream, and New Shimmer. These are the videos that will be associated with them. Rainbow Trip is it's still. It's not moving, but it's gonna. Let me turn it on. How about that? So it's got basically a rainbow edge around it. It might be easier to see by rotating. It's the reason that the rotate one is the first parameter at the top. You can kind of see the colors changing. I mean, if you notice, like let's just look at this right here. Like it's got red on top, blue on bottom. If you roll this thing, whoops, where am I going here? Now you've got kind of blue on top and red on bottom. It's rotating those colors, that color set around basically in a 360 circle. It's not moving, it's just there. And the reason I'm making a distinction because in the next one, Fever Dream, it's the same spectrum, but it's undulating. It's kind of getting bigger than smaller, kind of breathing in a way, if you will. And then subsequently after that, the New Shimmer, which we'll get to, it is more animated and rolling through those colors. So Rainbow Trip does not have any animation. Fever Dream does, but it's just it's kind of breathing. We'll put it that way. And but the New Shimmer is actually changing the color. It's rolling. So here you can kind of dial this in, whatever you want to be kind of the dominant color. You can dial in the saturation. You can dial it down, go up to 3, get kind of crazy. I'll keep it at 3. Blur, if you take it off, it's obviously going to get sharper and more pronounced. But you can click on this, hold it down, and push it. And really, you can get all kind of a soapy look with this as well. Very soft, kind of rainbow, kind of a dreamy kind of look with it. So I'm going to bring that mix down. On the blur, you've got your shadow, midtone, highlight control for what I've explained earlier, is just in case your footage gets kind of crazy. So this one you can also adjust the vignette. It's got a center cut in it. It's off by default, obviously, and all the standard effects for that. All right, moving on. Fever Dream. So this one is animating. It's kind of breathing these colors. Let's look at it in motion since this one actually moves. Undulating. You can control the hue of it, how much of it you want in there, the opacity, the saturation. You can go crazy if you want. Let's keep it there. Smear, if you want it to be kind of, let's bring it up, the opacity. So you can see kind of what the smear does. I'll be exaggerated with it. So it kind of leaves a little, the bounds of the footage, what it's doing to the footage. It'll just smear over it. So it's not as obvious, like these branches, here, like obviously it's taking this and adjusting it. But if you smear it, it's a lot less obvious where it's getting the information from, if that makes sense. You can toggle the color balance. You're not going to see much of a difference, but on some footage you may, so that's there. You've got a center vignette, and you've got all the rest of the things we've already gone through. And the last one is the New Shimmer. Turn this on, and we'll play it. So this one is animating. It's rolling through the colors, which is really, crazy, trippy. You can adjust the speed of it. I'll speed it up. And it's going to go through them faster. You can adjust the amplitude. So it's really going to start to look like a light show when I do that. You've got control over your 2 different prisms. You know, how crazy you want to be. But let's look at that. I mean, that's something else. So you've got independent control over 2 of them. Saturation, blur. It's already kind of blurred a lot, but you can do it some more. So it's really a lot more subtle. In fact, let's do one that's subtle. Let's turn this down some, turn this down. See what it looks like. I mean, there's no getting around it. This is just one of the more trippy kind of presets. A lot of the same controls. You can control how much of the blur is mixed in. Highlight control, shadow control, yada, yada. Contrast if you really want to push it. And you can vignette this. And it's also got the edge fix as well. A lot of the standard controls on most of them, so you've got control over it. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching. And if you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks.